In the summer of 1938, a man named Hugh Lord stood on the porch of his home in St. Thomas, Nevada, and watched the water come for the last time. He had lived in this house for years. He'd raised a family here, walked these streets, knew every neighbor by name. And now, as Lake Mead, the massive new reservoir created by Hoover Dam, crept closer day by day, Hugh Lord made a choice that would become local legend. Rather than leave quietly, he set his own house on fire and rode away from the flames, watching his home burn as the rising water reached its foundation. He was the last resident of St. Thomas to leave. Within days, the town he'd spent his life in disappeared completely beneath the surface of the lake. But here's what most people don't know. St. Thomas didn't stay buried. Founded in 1865 by Mormon settlers who believed they were establishing a community in Arizona territory, they were wrong. It was actually Nevada, a surveying error that wouldn't be corrected for years. St. Thomas grew into a real town. By the 1930s, it had a school, a hotel, an ice cream parlor, and roads connecting it to the wider world. Around 500 people called it home. Then came Hoover Dam. Completed in 1936, it created Lake Mead, and the rising water swallowed everything in the valley below, including St. Thomas. The federal government paid residents for their land, but many, like Hugh Lord, watched their entire world vanish underwater. For 7 years, St. Thomas existed only in memory, a ghost town at the bottom of a lake, completely invisible. Then in 1945, something happened that nobody expected. A drought caused Lake Mead's water level to drop low enough that the ruins of St. Thomas broke the surface for the first time since the flooding. Foundations. Walls. The outline of streets. Crowds came, including people who had once lived there, walking through the ruins of their former town and recognizing chimneys and doorframes that hadn't seen daylight in years. But the water came back. And St. Thomas disappeared again. This pattern, submersion, exposure, submersion, would repeat itself for the next 80 years, turning St. Thomas into something rare in American history. A town that drowned and resurfaced again and again, depending on how much snow fell in the Rocky Mountains and how much water flowed into Lake Mead. Most people think that's where the story ends. A flooded town, a drought, a ghostly return. But that's only part of what the water buried. Because St. Thomas wasn't the only thing Lake Mead swallowed in the 1930s. Just a few miles away lay the remains of something far older, the traces of an ancient community that had lived in this valley more than 1,000 years before Hugh Lord ever stood on that porch, watching the water rise. And as strange as it sounds, the story of that lost community became tied forever to the story of St. Thomas. Because when the lake drops, it doesn't always give back the same things. Sometimes it reveals pieces of a past that was already ancient when St. Thomas was founded. And that story begins several years before Hugh Lord ever struck a match. 3 years before Hugh Lord ever struck a match. A different race against the water was already underway, about 8 miles from where his house would later burn. In 1924, a Nevada schoolteacher named Faye Perkins was exploring the desert near the Muddy River when she came across pottery fragments and the remains of ancient adobe walls rising from the ground. Curious about what she had found, she began investigating on her own. The more she uncovered, the more convinced she became that this place was important. Perkins wrote letters to the Smithsonian Institution, hoping experts would come examine the site. Eventually they did. And what they found was far bigger than anyone expected. The remains belonged to a major ancient settlement occupied for centuries. Archaeologists determined that people had lived here from roughly 300 AD to 1150 AD. They built multi-room structures, developed irrigation systems to farm in the desert, and maintained trade networks that stretched hundreds of miles across the southwest. Artifacts recovered from the area included seashells from coastal regions and materials that had traveled great distances before arriving in this valley. The site became known as the Lost City. By the early 1930s, archaeologists working through New Deal programs began one of the largest archaeological projects Nevada had ever seen. Hundreds of workers carefully excavated structures, recovered artifacts, and documented evidence of a thriving community that had existed long before European settlement reached the region. But there was a problem. While archaeologists were uncovering the past, engineers were building the future. Just downstream, construction crews were completing Hoover Dam. Everyone involved understood what that meant. Once the dam was finished, the waters of Lake Mead would begin rising, and much of the lost city would end up underwater. Suddenly, the excavation became a race against time. Researchers worked as quickly as possible between 1933 and 1938, documenting structures, recovering pottery and tools, and preserving whatever they could before the reservoir reached the site. Many of the artifacts they saved eventually became part of the collection housed at the Lost City Museum in Overton, Nevada, where they remain today. But despite years of work, archaeologists couldn't excavate everything. Large portions of the settlement remained untouched when the water arrived. Entire sections of the site disappeared beneath Lake Mead before researchers had the opportunity to fully study them. What was left behind wasn't necessarily less important. It was simply unreachable. And that reality created a strange connection between the lost city and St. Thomas. Both communities were swallowed by the same lake. One was a farming town from the early 20th century. The other was an ancient settlement that had already been abandoned for centuries. Yet both vanished beneath the rising water within just a few years of each other. For decades, they remained hidden together beneath the surface. Most visitors who came to Lake Mead never realized that beneath the water lay more than one lost community. They knew about the ghost town of St. Thomas. Few knew that an unfinished archaeological story was resting nearby. And every time drought lowered the lake, researchers wondered the same thing. Had the water uncovered something that earlier generations never had the chance to see? As the decades passed, that question became more important. Because Lake Mead was beginning to change in ways nobody had anticipated. And the next major drop in water levels would expose far more than anyone expected. By the early 1980s, Lake Mead had been full or close to it for decades. St. Thomas had slipped beneath the surface again after its brief reappearance in 1945, and most people who hadn't lived there had largely forgotten it existed at all. The nature reminded everyone how quickly things could change. In 1983, unusually heavy snowmelt filled the Colorado River system beyond expectations. Lake Mead rose dramatically, and for the first time since Hoover Dam was completed, water poured through the dam's spillways. The flow was so powerful that it damaged portions of the spillway tunnels themselves. It was a reminder that Lake Mead was never truly stable. The lake could rise rapidly, and it could fall just as dramatically. That reality became even more apparent in the years that followed. By 2002, declining snowpack across the Rocky Mountains helped push Lake Mead into what would become one of the most significant drought periods in its history. Water levels began dropping year after year, exposing more shoreline than most people had ever seen. And once again, St. Thomas emerged from the water. This time, things were different. The town didn't reappear for just a brief period. It remained exposed for years. Visitors walked the old streets, photographers documented the ruins, descendants of former residents traveled to see the place their parents and grandparents had described for decades. Among them were relatives of Hugh Lord, standing on the same ground where he had once watched the water approach and made the decision that turned him into local legend. For many families, it was an emotional experience. The town wasn't just history. It was memory. As visitor numbers increased, the National Park Service began documenting the exposed landscape more thoroughly. Foundations, roads, building remains, and other features were carefully recorded and compared with historical maps. Most of what appeared matched exactly what researchers expected to find. But not everything. In areas beyond the better-known portions of St. Thomas, observers occasionally noticed stonework and structural remains that didn't fit neatly into the town's recorded layout. That wasn't necessarily surprising. The shoreline around St. Thomas sits within a region containing layers of human history stretching back centuries before the town itself existed. Archaeologists had long known that the broader valley contained evidence of ancient settlements, travel routes, agricultural activity, and communities that predated the arrival of Mormon settlers by hundreds of years. As more ground remained exposed year after year, researchers became increasingly interested in what these newly visible areas might reveal. The possibility was exciting, not because anyone expected a dramatic treasure-filled discovery, but because long periods of low water created opportunities that earlier generations never had. The archaeologists who raced against Lake Mead in the 1930s worked under enormous pressure. They knew the water was coming and had only a limited amount of time to save what they could. Modern researchers suddenly had something their predecessors lacked: time. For the first time since Hoover Dam transformed the valley, archaeologists could spend years observing some of these exposed areas instead of weeks or months. And that raised an intriguing possibility. What if some of the places left unexplored in the 1930s were becoming accessible again? What if parts of the story Faye Perkins helped uncover nearly a century earlier were finally reappearing? As drought conditions continued and the shoreline remained exposed, researchers began taking a closer look. What they learned added new pieces to a story that many people thought had already been told. With portions of the shoreline remaining exposed for years, archaeologists finally had opportunities that earlier generations could only have imagined. Researchers from museums, universities, and government agencies continued studying the landscape around St. Thomas and the nearby Lost City region, comparing newly visible features with records created during the original excavations of the 1930s. In some locations, previously submerged remains appeared consistent with the broader archaeological history of the valley. While many of these features required careful study before any conclusions could be reached, they reinforced something researchers had suspected for decades. The story of this area was larger than any single settlement. St. Thomas was only one chapter. The Lost City was another. And both were part of a much longer history of human activity in the valley. As investigations continued, archaeologists gained a better understanding of how communities had adapted to life in this harsh desert environment over hundreds and even thousands of years. Evidence from earlier excavations showed that ancient residents developed irrigation systems, established trade connections, and built communities capable of surviving in conditions that many outsiders would have considered impossible. Those discoveries helped place St. Thomas into a broader historical context. Although separated by centuries, both the ancient inhabitants of the Lost City and the settlers of St. Thomas faced similar challenges. They relied on the valley's water sources, adapted to the desert climate, and built communities in a landscape that could be both generous and unforgiving. The difference was that one community disappeared long before written records existed, while the other vanished within living memory. As researchers pieced together information from old excavation records, museum collections, and newly exposed sites, they were reminded of something important. The work begun in the 1920s and 1930s was never truly finished. Many areas flooded by Lake Mead had only been partially studied before the reservoir filled. Some locations had never been examined at all. Every major drought created a new opportunity to revisit questions that earlier archaeologists simply didn't have time to answer. But access to those places was never guaranteed. The same water that revealed them could erase them again. A site visible one summer might disappear beneath the lake the next. That uncertainty shaped every investigation. Researchers often had to document quickly, collect as much information as possible, and prepare for the possibility that years might pass before the same location became accessible again. In many ways, Lake Mead had become an unexpected partner in the research process. When water levels rose, archaeologists analyzed records, studied artifacts, and reviewed previous findings. When water levels fell, they returned to the field and continued the search. Over time, a clearer picture emerged. The valley wasn't defined by a single discovery or a single lost town. It was defined by layers. Ancient communities, later indigenous groups, pioneer settlements, and modern researchers were all connected through the same landscape. And every time the shoreline shifted, another small piece of that story surfaced. What fascinated researchers most wasn't necessarily what had already been found. It was what remained unexplored. Because despite nearly a century of investigation, large portions of the valley's history still remain hidden beneath Lake Mead. Waiting, just as they have for decades. And as water levels continued to fluctuate in the years that followed, attention increasingly turned toward a simple but important question. How much of the story is still down there, waiting for the next time the lake retreats? That question has become one of the most fascinating aspects of Lake Mead's history. Most reservoirs simply cover what was there before. Once the water rises, the story is effectively over. Lake Mead is different. For nearly 90 years, the lake has repeatedly revealed pieces of the past that many people assumed were gone forever. Droughts expose roads, foundations, walls, irrigation features, and archaeological sites. Then changing conditions send them underwater again. The cycle repeats. And with each cycle, researchers learn a little more. One reason the area continues to attract attention is because the Mopa Valley has been important to human communities for an extraordinarily long time, long before St. Thomas existed, long before the Lost City flourished. People were moving through this landscape, using its water sources and adapting to its challenges. Archaeological evidence from the broader region shows human activity stretching back thousands of years. That means every new exposure carries potential significance. A section of shoreline that appears unremarkable at first glance could contain clues about a farming community from centuries ago. Another area might preserve evidence connected to much older periods of human occupation. For researchers, patience is essential. Archaeology rarely works like the movies. Major discoveries are seldom made overnight. More often, understanding develops piece by piece. A foundation compared with an old survey map, an artifact linked to a museum collection, a newly exposed feature examined alongside records created decades earlier. The story of Lake Mead has unfolded in much the same way. Each generation inherits information gathered by the one before it. Faye Perkins passed her observations to professional archaeologists. The excavation teams of the 1930s preserved artifacts and records for future researchers. Modern archaeologists continue building upon that foundation whenever changing water levels provide the opportunity. At the same time, indigenous communities have contributed perspectives that extend beyond written records. For generations, native peoples maintained knowledge of this landscape through oral history, preserving connections to places that archaeologists would only begin studying much later. Today, cooperation between researchers, museums, government agencies, and tribal communities has become an increasingly important part of understanding the valley's past. Each group brings different knowledge, and together they help create a fuller picture of what this landscape has meant to the people who lived here. Yet despite all the work that has been done, many questions remain unanswered. Researchers know far more about the region today than they did in 1924, when Faye Perkins first noticed pottery fragments in the desert. But they also know how much remains unknown. Some locations have never been thoroughly examined. Others remain inaccessible beneath the water. And some questions may require decades of future research before reliable answers emerge. That's part of what makes this story so compelling. It isn't a mystery because nobody has investigated it. It's a mystery because people have been investigating it for nearly a century and are still finding new pieces of the puzzle. Every drought creates another opportunity. Every rise in water pauses the search. And somewhere beneath the surface of Lake Mead, there are still chapters of this story that haven't been read yet. By the mid-2020s, researchers had begun looking at Lake Mead differently than the people who first watched it fill. In the 1930s, the rising reservoir felt like a deadline. Archaeologists rushed to save what they could before the water arrived. Residents of St. Thomas packed their belongings and left homes that their families had built over generations. For many people, it seemed as though the lake was bringing an ending. Today, there's a broader understanding that the story didn't end when the water rose. It simply changed. The lake has become part of the history of the valley itself. Its constant fluctuations have created a unique situation where the past occasionally returns to view, allowing each generation to learn something new from the same landscape. Researchers now recognize that long-term observation may be just as important as any single excavation. Some years provide access to locations that remain hidden during wetter periods. Other years offer opportunities to compare newly exposed features with records gathered decades earlier. Information accumulates slowly, but over time it builds a more complete picture of the valley's past. This approach requires patience. No one can predict exactly what future droughts or wet years will reveal. Water levels are influenced by snowfall, climate conditions, river flows, and the needs of millions of people who depend on the Colorado River system. The shoreline changes accordingly. What is visible today may be underwater tomorrow. What remains hidden now may emerge years from now. For archaeologists, historians, and tribal communities connected to this region, that uncertainty has become part of the process. Instead of viewing each exposure as a final opportunity, many now see it as one chapter in a much longer effort to understand the valley. The goal is no longer simply to race against the water. The goal is to learn from its rhythm. When the lake falls, researchers document what becomes visible. When it rises, they study the information they've gathered and prepare for the next opportunity. In many ways, that rhythm mirrors the history of the valley itself. Communities have come and gone here for centuries. Some left behind buildings, others left artifacts, stories, and traditions. Each generation added another layer to the landscape before eventually becoming part of its history. The remains of those generations still exist. Some are displayed in museums. Some survive in written records. Some live on through family stories and oral traditions. And some remain hidden beneath the waters of Lake Mead, waiting for the next shift in the shoreline. That possibility continues to draw people back. Not because they expect to solve every mystery, but because every glimpse of the past helps connect the present to the people who came before. And nowhere is that connection more visible than in the story of St. Thomas, a town that disappeared, returned, disappeared again, and somehow became a gateway to a much deeper history than anyone first imagined. Today, the story is still unfinished. It's worth stepping back for a moment and looking at everything that happened in this valley. It began with people whose names have been lost to history, building lives along the waterways of the Mopa Valley centuries before recorded history reached this part of the American Southwest. Generations came and went. Communities grew, adapted, and left their mark on the landscape. Centuries later, settlers arrived and established St. Thomas, building homes, businesses, schools, and farms in a place they believed would be their future. For decades it was. Then came Hoover Dam. The project transformed the American West, provided water and electricity to millions, and created Lake Mead, a reservoir so large that it erased entire communities from the map. Among them was St. Thomas. In the summer of 1938, Hugh Lord stood on his porch and watched that transformation happen in real time. Rather than quietly abandon the home where he'd built his life, he chose one final act that people would remember for generations. He set his house on fire and rode away as the rising water approached. Within days, his town was gone. At the time, many believed the story ended there. But the water never stayed still. Again and again, Lake Mead dropped low enough to reveal pieces of what it had buried. Roads emerged, foundations reappeared, visitors walked streets that hadn't been seen in decades. Families returned to places they thought they would never see again. And with every major drought, another truth became clear. St. Thomas was only one layer of the story. Beneath the memory of the town lay traces of older communities. Beneath those communities were signs of even earlier human activity. The deeper researchers looked, the longer the timeline became. What makes this valley remarkable isn't a single discovery. It's the way so many different chapters of human history overlap in the same place. Ancient settlements, indigenous traditions, pioneer communities, modern archaeological research, all connected by the same stretch of land and the same body of water. Nearly a century ago, archaeologists racing against the rising reservoir believed they were documenting the final moments of a disappearing world. Instead, they preserved the beginning of a story that future generations would continue exploring. Faye Perkins couldn't have known where her discovery would lead when she first noticed pottery fragments in the desert in 1924. Hugh Lord couldn't have known that his flooded town would someday draw visitors from around the world. And the people who lived in this valley centuries before either of them could never have imagined that traces of their lives would still be studied hundreds of years later. Yet here we are. The lake rises. The lake falls. History disappears. History returns. And somewhere beneath the surface of Lake Mead, there are still stories waiting for the next drought, the next survey, and the next generation willing to look a little closer. If this story stayed with you, you know what to do. Thanks for spending this time with Forgotten Echoes. And until next time, remember this. Sometimes the most fascinating places aren't the ones we've discovered. They're the ones we've already found but haven't fully understood yet.